massaging my videos and talking about them. Let's do Forever Man. I wrote this one after The Great Influencer, but it took so much editing that it came out. I wrote this before The Great Influencer, but it took so much editing that it came out after The Great Influencer. So, this book starts with this girl, and she gets a job in Chicago. And she's heading to her new job, and she sees this blanket on the ground, and she's just wondering, like, she kind of trips on it, and she just looks down, and there's like this random blanket. So she goes into this job interview, and they're like, we will take you to your new boss, and he wants to meet you personally. And it's basically like, she's like, really? Like, the owner of this, the CEO of this corporation wants to meet me personally? Because literally on the walk-in, she looked at a magazine rack and his face was on the cover of Times. And so he's like this big famous CEO. And she's like, I'm just like a lowly secretary. He wants to interview me personally on my first day. So she goes up the elevator to this like penthouse suite of an office overlooking the Chicago skyline. And she walks up, and he's sitting at his desk in his underwear, and he's shirtless, and he might have pants on, I can't remember, but he's definitely shirtless. So, and he's kind of like, hello, and he basically tells her, in order for this job interview, you have to understand where this company comes from. And so he's like, I'm gonna tell you the story of how this company came to be. And then so chapter 2 starts, and it's a young version of him. And he's about the same age, I guess. But he's like maybe like 10 years younger looking. And he's about the same age. I can't remember. Anyway, so he's kind of working for his dad, who his dad owns this a pharmaceutical company, and they have a lab where they test drugs, and he's trying to make immortality. And so the main character kind of goes in and he gets tested on. Like, they run these tests, and his dad's trying to find immortality for himself. And so he is basically, because his DNA is so close to his dad doesn't actually care for him. So his dad puts him through the ringer and like injects him with all these test drugs to see what will work on his dad whenever he finds something successful. And they have like monkeys and rats and stuff in cages that they test. And so, he feels like he's just another one of the rats or another one of the monkeys, like his father doesn't really care about him. So at night he goes to the bar, and he goes under these gaslit lamps, and he noticed how one of the lamps has electricity, and it's kind of, he's just marveled at it because there's no electricity yet on this street. And they're like, electricity is just at the cusp of its invention. And he kind of gets hit. He stumbles out of the bar drunk, and he almost gets hit by this like horse carriage looking automobile. And it's one of the first ones he's ever seen. He's like kind of in awe at this new horseless carriage that drives by. And so he ends up the next day, he goes, and his dad wants him to try these 2 pills. So he tries both these pills, and then he goes out for a night of drinking again, And then he ends up taking these two women back to a hotel. And on the way, he passes this homeless guy. And the homeless guy is asking for money. And one of the women he's with walks up and tries to give him money, and he pulls her back. And he's like, you don't know how unsanitary these people are. Like, stay away from these people. And he pulls out his coin, and he's like, you want this? He's like, here, go get it. And he throws this coin over the guy into a river. But the homeless guy just doesn't look at the coin, just never stops staring at him. And he looks in this guy's eyes, and they're so, like, encapsulating. Like, it's almost like there's a whole universe behind his eyes. And so the main character here, who is, what the heck is his name? Let's see. Constantine. I should have known that. Constantine Neonite. So he starts off Constantine Neonite, and by the end of the book, he changes his last name to Plenary. So the corporation is called Plenary Inc. So he wakes up in the morning, he's alone, and he's expecting to be super hungover, but he wakes up and he feels almost like he got a really good night's sleep. He doesn't feel like he went out partying at all. And so he kind of makes his way into work, and he's super excited about it, but then they want to do these experiments on him. And so he basically, they cut his hand, and he's horrified. They tie him down, and his dad watches, they cut his hand, but as he stares, the wound heals. So whatever it was in those pills, it made it so that he, like, basically has a healing ability. And so he's, like, horrified. And then they run these tests where they burn him and they try all these things. And he sits there and he's horrified, but he's also amazed because he's healing from it. And so finally they let him go. And so he, like, spends the next week getting experimented on. And then he ends up, he spends his nights at the bar just drinking, and he does, like, drinking competitions with people, and he's just, like, doesn't care because he gets hungover and his dad pays for it all in exchange for him being experimented on. And one night he meets this girl, and this girl, she really wows him, and they spend a night at the bar together, and she's, like, asking him to show her he basically cuts himself as a bar trick, like, to show off to people. And so she asks to see more, and she asks him all about it. And eventually, at the end of the night, she asks to go with him, like, let's go to your work. Let's go check it out. I want to see it. And he's like, okay, sure. So he takes her into his dad's work, and they go in there, and basically she keeps asking, like, what did they do? And anyway, she coaxes him over to the pills, where he took the pills, and he's kind of feeling uneasy about it, a little off, and she actually snatches the pills, but he grabs her, and he grabs her, and he grabs one of the two pills, and then she hits him, and he falls, and she takes off running. And at the same time, it started raining outside, so it's a really rainy night, and he's not used to rain. It doesn't really rain much. And so he's like, she runs off, and she takes off in the night to the left, and there's a security guard there, and he's like, is everything all right? And he's like, get that girl. But they go out into the dark, rainy night, and they can't see that far because it's raining pretty hard. And she's just kind of disappeared in the night, and he's left with just one pill. And he's like, oh my gosh, I lost one of the two pills that's my father's for his trying to find the fountain of youth. So the next day, his dad is furious, but the rain hasn't kept up, and city's kind of starting to flood in certain areas. And so he is, like, really mad, and the rain's been pouring. And so he's kind of getting punished, and he turns into the janitor, and he thinks being a janitor is so much beneath him. And so for the next couple of days, he's the janitor. And he's going to work, and the rain just never stops. It never lets up. And one of the days as the janitor, he's there, and the river in the city begins to flood. There's been so much rain that the river can't keep up, and it floods over, and the streets start to fill up, and they start to have earthquakes. And so he's feeling all these earthquakes, and so he comes and like he's like in the building, like shaking, and all the animals are going wild. So they his dad tells everyone to go home, and he actually stays a little while longer. And when he goes to leave, he goes down to the lobby, and the water in the lobby is like a foot high. And he's like, oh my gosh. And so his dad has one of those motorless carriages, an automobile. And so they push the door open against the flood, and more water comes rushing in, filling the whole place. And they're like shocked at how much water there is. So they get in the horseless carriage, and it's like tall enough to stay above the water. And they drive out of the city into higher ground where it's not as flooded. And they decide that they're going to go wait out the rain and all this flooding. They have a cottage up in the mountains. So they're going to head up in the mountains. And so the dad packs up his other brothers and sisters who are a lot older than he is. And they kind of like, he packs up his immediate family into his automobile once they're home. And then like the family meets there because of the storm. And so they all get automobiles, and then he sets Constantine on just a regular horse-drawn carriage with the other help. And so he's kind of like, yeah, I'm like the black sheep of the family. He's like, my dad's sending me back here with all the help. And like they're riding on ahead. So the flooding continues, and they head up into they spend like a day, it's like a day's travel just to get up this mountain. And there's a town up there. And in the town, there's this zoo which has this giant boa constrictor that's called Titan is the name of it. And this boa constrictor in this zoo is like 50 foot long. Like its head is like this big around, just like this freakish thing. Like this snake is like this big around, and it's just in this zoo, and the whole town is kind of dedicated to it. They have a fountain of the snake fighting a giant alligator, I think, in the town square. And the fountain's not on because of all the rain. So he eventually, he's just like, there's nothing to do in this town, so he's just checking out this indoor zoo that's dedicated to this snake. And he eventually goes home to his family, and they notice all these animals keep passing through their yard. And pretty soon people start coming up the mountain in droves, like refugees. And they're saying like all the land is flooding, and there's these giant springs that opened up from the ground, just shooting all this water up. And it's just like everywhere is just flooded, and it's growing, and it's like coming. And so all of a sudden there's just so many refugees that they start coming onto their property. And so they have all these refugees, and they can't get them off. And these people are just kind of camping on their property. And then there's even animals, and there's like mice and rats just moving in and out of the camp. And then one morning, Owen wakes up and he looks out at the mountainous view, but instead what he sees is an ocean. So he can't see down the mountain anymore. He just sees the water level, and it's like about to reach their yard. And so all the people camping kind of head up, and then Owen and his brother, they get their dad, and they all decide that they're just going to head into the wilderness, follow the animals, and just head up the mountain, just kind of blindly. So all the people and everyone just head up this mountain, and they're running. And Owen's got his dad. His dad's like 90 years old. He's old. And he's just like old as old can be. And so he's hanging behind, and the help, once this water is like chasing, it's almost keeping up with them as they head up the water. And so Caden is with his dad, but the help panic, and they see the water and they let go of the dad, and they're like, screw this, and they just leave him, start running. And Constantine's like, well, I'm not going to leave my dad. So they're all running up this hill, and they find this spot where there's a small, like a 10-foot cliff, where there's a walking path where steps have been carved in, but there's so many people crammed that they can't get up there. And meanwhile, the water almost hits their feet as they're trying to wait. So Caden kind of gets lost in the crowd, and he like boosts up his dad, and then he tries to climb up and gets over, but he gets lost and he can't find his dad anymore. And the water is already, he looks, it's already like rising up the cliff, and it's about to go over the cliff and keep coming up. And the crowd, like there's people still waiting in the water, people who couldn't get in. And so he's trying to find his dad. And finally he's like, maybe once I boosted him up, he just headed up the trail and he's further up. Like there's no one here and the water's here. I have to go looking further up the trail. And then as he's doing that, he's heading up the trail, he can't find him, he's calling, but the water is just right behind him, always, just following him. And at one point, he gets knocked over because of that snake from the zoo, the Titan, and it goes right by him. And he goes like, everyone in the crowd like screams, everyone falls away, but the snake has no interest in them. It's just running up the mountain itself. And so as that snake goes by, they get up and they go running. But as Caden's going, the water catches him, and like it falls into his waist, and it's ice cold water, and he breaks free and he starts running, and but he's just getting so out of breath, and he's fighting this water, and he's running and running, and then eventually just the water's just too quickly rising, and it kind of grabs his legs again and slows him down and trips him up, and then it overtakes him, and all of a sudden he's in his chest and he's like floating, and he's like trying to grab a tree, but these waves just keep hitting him and bashing him around. And eventually he just gets so tired, and the water begins to rise. So where he's at, there's all of a sudden like no trees, like he's above the trees. Now he's just in the middle of water, like basically in the middle of this ocean. And the waves are throwing him around, and eventually he goes under and he can't get up to the surface, and he passes out. But then he wakes up, and well, first of all, it goes back to the girl in the interview, and she's like, you drowned? Like, what? And he's like, yeah, just keep listening. And so they actually go down. He's like, can we go downstairs and get lunch? And in the lobby, he has a limo driver waiting for him, and the limo driver has a suit. And so Constantine puts on his suit, and now he's dressed, and they go out in a limo. And so back in Constantine's story, he wakes up in just a wasteland of like, he's half buried in mud, and he wakes up and he's looking around, and he's like lost, and he's at the edge of basically a beach, and there's just waves just calmly lapping, and he's like in this like mud, he's like half covered, and he slowly breaks free, and he stands up and he panics because he sees the giant boa constrictor, and he's like totally panicked, like rushes back on his hands and knees, but then he realizes it's dead. But then he realizes like the smell is really nasty, and he looks around him, and all around him is like all the other people and everything, and everyone's basically drowned and just scattered all across this beach, except for the pills kept him alive. So his healing factor basically kept him alive. So then he heads down, and he starts following the water as it recedes kind of down this mountain, and the mountain begins to rise up around him as the water reveals it, and he's like, he doesn't know what to do, so he's just following it, but it's a wasteland. And he essentially gets so thirsty that he turns into basically a walking zombie. Like for like 5, 6, 7, 10 days, 20 days, 30 days, he's just following this water, and it's salt water. There's nothing he can drink, but the pills keep him alive. So he can't die, but there's nothing to sustain him. There's no food, there's no water. So he essentially just turns into like this zombie creature that he hears himself moaning all the time. And then eventually he sees a puddle that gets left behind. And in this puddle is fish that get caught up. So he grabs a fish and just basically eats them right there out of the puddle. And then he finds like fresh water. Like it kind of like sprinkles here and there, and he'll like drink the fresh water. Or I think he comes across a stream somewhere. Eventually he gets far enough down, like towards the mainland, and he finds a stream and it's fresh water, and he kind of drinks that. Something like that, I can't remember. So then he's walking around and he sees the girl from the bar that took the pill. He runs into her in the wild and he's like, hey, it's you. And he chases her, and he's like, hey, and she sees him, like panics, and she's just as rough looking as him. And she takes off running, and he takes off running after her. And he eventually follows her into a bunch of these rocks that are kind of stacked weird. And as he goes in there, she's hiding around the corner with a log and just hits him in the head and knocks him out. And he wakes up in the ground and she's just gone. No trace. He looks for her for a while, but he can't find her. And so in the meantime, plants have started to grow up, like weeds have started to grow. He decides he's going to follow this river. And on the river, when he runs into her, before he sees flowers, it's the first color he's seen since the flood. And he's just mesmerized by these flowers. And that's when he sees her. And so he keeps walking, and he keeps going for days down this river, just doesn't know why he's wandering, but it's fresh water. And he sees a little baby rabbit eventually up the river. And he's like in awe. So he follows this rabbit, and he goes off the river, and he sees smoke. And he's like, it's a fire. So he gets confronted by these, he goes to find these people, and he gets confronted by these people who are like these old men in Rome in robes and like hairy beards. And as they get talking, he realizes they're like these religious people. He calls them adamites, and they're basically like Amish. And he's like kind of distraught because he's like, the only people left in the world are the Amish. Like, all I want is to get back to society, to get back to my place. I run into the Amish. So this guy, the leader, his two sons are Shem and Ham, and the dad is Noah. And so Noah's got this big boat. We'll call it an ark. And so he comes, and they take in Constantine, and they feed him. And he's like in awe because they have all these animals in cages and stuff. And they explain that they've let out all of the animals that aren't predators, and they've let these non-predator animals just roam and spread, the rabbits and whatnot. And he's like, pretty soon we're gonna let out the apex predators. He's like, but we just want the other animals to be able to get a foothold first. And so Constantine's like, what? But they're uncomfortable. Like, they kind of think Constantine's a demon. They're like, you shouldn't be here. So Noah's like, hey, my sons are really nervous about you. Like, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to stay somewhere else. So Constantine, after they feed him and they give him new clothes, which are these robes, and he's like clean and comfortable for the first time. He gets food. Then they're like, you're gonna have to leave. Like, we don't know. You should not be here. But he doesn't want to like leave them. So he goes and camps like 2 or 3 miles away on top of a hill where he can see the ark. And he stays up there. And Noah's like, this is a good place for you. And so he'll be up there, but he doesn't know what he's doing. And Noah kind of visits him. And eventually Noah like starts bringing him provisions, and Noah teaches him how to build a home on this hill. And so he learns woodworking from Noah. But eventually Noah kind of gets old, and Noah's sons still come around, but they don't trust him that much. But eventually Noah dies, and he hears about it, and he's sad. But Noah's sons and their grandsons see that Constantine hasn't aged since they first met him. And so they're like, yeah, this guy's like a demon or something. Like, this guy's not right. So they like start avoiding him. So then Constantine kind of becomes secluded. And as the trees and the growth kind of builds up, he can't see the ark anymore. It kind of gets overgrown. And then one day he notices like the ark begins to get torn down and huts are built around it. And then a forest builds around his house. And then so he can't really see. And he just lives in the middle of the woods using Noah's techniques to just keep his home in order. And he just lives there and he gardens and he takes these lessons and he learns to live off the land. One day, like, these kids come and they like see him and they run away. And it's almost like they're like playing a game, like who can go the closest to his house. And so he's like, what the heck? Like, how long has it been? So he decides to come out. And when he gets to the bottom of this hill, he comes out. He emerges at like this makeshift city. And there's streets and there's huts and there's these buildings. But the dead center of the city, there's this giant tower that just stretches into the air. And it has like Noah's building technique that he used for the ark. He can recognize it's still in the architecture of this tower. And he's like blown away at this thing. And he's just so fascinated that he goes to it. And basically he sees a sign that says, you know, if you want to work on this, well, here's the wages we'll provide you. And he's like, I'll do it. So he actually like takes a job helping work on this tower. And he gets up in this tower and he helps them build it for a couple of years. And they just keep building and building and building. And they're saying like we can build this tower to God. Like, that's how great we are at building. And one day he's in town, he's getting lunch, he's on his break. There's this bright flash and he falls on the ground and he can hear the tower just collapsing. And he wakes up and it's just chaos and dust in the street. And he looks around, but some lady's screaming, but he can't understand her. And there's a man and like they're like speaking gibberish. He can't understand either of them. And so he eventually goes around and he realizes that the people have been transported. Like, there's people that are just disappearing in the city. And some people wander into the city and they say like, yeah, we were in the middle of the city and we woke up like 3 miles away. And it's like, whoa, like people are just transported everywhere. And so eventually he gets a grip on this and, you know, the city kind of disperses and the city struggles because the gibberish people were speaking were different languages. So now there's people who can't understand each other, but there's other people that can understand that. And so all these people that speak these different languages like break off into these different groups, but then the city is no longer as unified as it was. And so Constantine starts trading between these people. He's like, he realizes like if he's around these people enough, he slowly begins to understand their gibberish and he understands all the different people. And so as he begins to learn all these different languages, he can inside of the city start to like trade. Like, he brings apples to this guy for logs to this guy. And eventually he builds this like company of like a trade company. But then the weather changes and it begins to freeze, and then he suffers through 300 years of winter basically, and it kills off like so many people and resources are so scarce. But he's still like working, trying to keep this company aside. But then eventually when the weather turns good, these people, they invent these weapons like bows and arrows, and they come in and they fight. And he realizes he's losing, like he's at risk of losing all the stuff he's worked for, because these armies that are now growing of these people could just come in and take all his stuff, because he has these, he like starts doing excavating too, because he realizes at some point he trades someone and they have a chest full of books, and the people's like, yeah, we were digging outside of town, we found this chest full of books. And he opens it and it's books from before the flood, books on astronomy, books on all these things. And he's just like blown away, and he's like, oh my gosh. So he takes all his money he made from trading, and he starts excavating, like digging in the earth, just these vast like mines of like just trying to dig down and get down to under the mud and get down to find artifacts. So he wants to bring back the world he knows. So he's like, if I can find more of this, I can bring back my world. Meanwhile, he lends some of his books to these Greek states at this time. And so these Greek people kind of he sends them these books on astronomy. In exchange, they send him gold and coins that he can use. And he has a business doing that, like trading information. And so eventually these armies start coming in, though, and taking everything out. And he's just so scared that one day just an army can come in and destroy everything, and all his books and all that astronomy can be lost. So he hears about this library in Alexandria. So he travels and he takes all the books he's found, and he goes to this library, and he sees this library, and he's just fascinated. He becomes a curator for it, and that way he can be around all this books and all this information. He can kind of go through it, and he sees that this library is advancing civilization. And he's like, the faster I can grow this library, the faster we can get back to my home, how the world was. And so he does that, but one day there's just this battle breaks out in the city. Once again, he's like, war has come to my doorstep. And it's these Roman soldiers, and they're fighting with these ships, but there's fire, and this fire breaks out in the city, and the fire spreads across the city, and it ends up catching the library on fire, and the whole thing burns down. And meanwhile, this guy named Caesar comes up to him and is like, I've heard about you, like your reputation spread. And meanwhile, the city's kind of burning. He's panicking, trying to put it out. He has all the workers doing a bucket brigade from the water, trying to stop the library, but it's no use, it's gone. And so Caesar is basically like, in the middle of this, like snatches him up and is like, you're gonna work for me by force. And so Caesar takes him in, and they have a meeting before Cleopatra. And he realizes Cleopatra's right hand, her aide, is the girl that took his pill, the one that he saw after the flood and ran off. And he's like, it's you. And she's panicked. And she like whispers to Cleopatra, and the soldiers come in, and like Caesar's like, no, like this ain't happening, because Caesar's the one with more authority there. And so she kind of stands down, and the girl is just kind of distraught. So then Constantine gets poisoned in the night, and but he wakes up healed, but he's like, oh, fine, this is the hangover of all hangovers. Like, finally, I feel a hangover because I was poisoned to death. And she is in the room waiting for him to wake up with guards there. And she basically says, Cleopatra believes me to be a god. She's like, I have been in Egypt for all these years pretending to be a god, and all the pharaohs, I've been helping them to build this country. She's like, this country, this empire, I have helped curate it, and they think I'm a god. And so she's like, Cleopatra saw my reaction to you, and she saw Caesar wouldn't let her touch you. She's like, so she had you poisoned in the night. It wasn't me. And so he's like, what? And she's like, yeah, I told her to stop. I told her, you are also a god. You are Ptah. And she's like, I'm Ptah. He's like, what? And so they have all these meetings with Cleopatra on one side and her, and then Caesar and Constantine on the other. And then eventually it's time for Caesar to go. So Constantine's basically Caesar's slave, so he forces him to go to Rome. And she had spent so much time with him, and they had so much in common. She has enough pull where she's like, I'm going to leave, and Cleopatra has the letter. So she follows him to Rome. And in Rome, they help Caesar run the government, but then they kind of start a romance a little bit, and they're distracted and Caesar gets killed, and they get handcuffed, and they get chained up after Caesar gets killed, and they get thrown into slavery, and they end up getting taken to Pompeii, where they're stuck in this basically as slaves working in this winery. And so they spend like 30 or 40 years working off their basically indentured servitude. So they work off everything, and then they go to the city of Pompeii and they start a pottery factory, and they end up making so much money that after such a long period of time, they buy the winery. So now they own the winery, and there they get married and have kids. But then there's this earthquake, and so Constantine takes two of his sons, and they head up to this mountain, and they see like the mountain has collapsed, and there's just this magma just bubbling, and they're like, oh my gosh. And Constantine falls into the magma, and he burns his foot, and so he passes out, and he wakes up in the morning, like he falls, and he's like grabbing and getting dragged down. So in the morning, he wakes up, but his foot is still scarred, and he's like, this is the first thing ever since I took the 2 pills that has ever left a mark. He's like, wow. So then they start having grandchildren, and even their grandchildren start having great-grandchildren. And all of a sudden, one day there's another earthquake, but then the mountain starts smoking, and it's really bad. And he's like, we have to get out of here. And there's like people fleeing the city, and it's kind of like starting to erupt, and it's starting to be really bad, and everyone's like getting out of there. But his son is like, there's people like running across our winery, like someone has to watch this place. And he's like, no, leave it, it's not worth it. This winery means nothing. And his son's like, this is the family winery, like this is our legacy as a family. And he can't convince his son to go, but the rest of the family's leaving, so he has to like guide the rest of the family out. And meanwhile, he's like, okay, just stay safe. If anything happens, go down in the cellar. You should be fine in the cellar. Like, don't fight anybody. And his son's like, I'll do that. Meanwhile, so they get like 10 miles out of town, and Pompeii just explodes, and the volcano is just so massive. And it's like all the way 10, 20 miles away, they're just getting ash like snowing on them. So they go back, and he can't find his son. He can't even hardly find the wine. It's like there's ash like 20 foot tall, and he can't find his son. He just has to accept that his son was killed. And so they, the rest of their family, they go to Rome, and they begin their lives anew in Rome. And their kids grow old and die, and their grandkids grow old and die, and their great-grandkids grow old and die. And as that happens, their kids begin to see them as like, their family begins to see them as like mythical creatures. Like, they're like, we're not part of our family anymore. And they decide not to have any more kids because it's too hard to watch them grow old and die. And he's like, it's just bad. So eventually they have a son, they have a great grandson who's named Constantine after him, and he ends up being an emperor. And so Constantine and his wife, they help him rule over the Roman Empire. And so they help this Constantine rule, but then like that goes on, and the Roman Empire starts to split, and their family begins to grow so distant that they're like, we don't even know these people anymore. Like, we're not even like attached to them, we're so distant. So they decide to just wander into the wilderness, and they kind of go into the Germanic Empire, and they kind of end up wandering all across Europe, just spending years, and they end up eventually hitting the Atlantic Ocean, and they end up in a little fishing town, and they stay there for a time, but then that gets attacked by Vikings, and there he sees his wife fight the Vikings, and he sees how she was trained in Egypt as a warrior. So she fights, and then so after that, then they sail to like Britain, and they hear about this new world, but Constantine is like, okay, his wife really wants to go to the new world, so they travel to the new world, And they end up like seeing how there's like this slavery in the New World and how they were slaves in Rome. So they're like, well, we were those people once. We don't want to live like that. So they become abolitionists. They become Quakers, basically. Was it aborigines? Anyway, so they grow this farm and they build it, and they end up being like, Constantine starts taking up metalworking, and he ends up being a blacksmith, and they have a farm, and she begins making pottery, and they end up like growing into this real civilized, like the leaders of their town, as like civilization slowly kind of starts to form in the New World. And meanwhile, his wife ends up getting pregnant again, and it's like on accident, and they're like, okay, I guess we're gonna have a child again. So they have this daughter. Meanwhile, they've decided that they don't want slavery in their town, so they're gonna work these people out of this slavery. And so they basically like give the townspeople an ultimatum, like, you can do your stuff without slaves, or we're gonna run you out of business. We have a monopoly on all the industries, so we'll come into your industry and we'll take your livelihood away. So you're not doing it in our town with slaves. And so the townspeople one night come to their house with pitchforks, and the town's name is Salem. And they end up like getting wrongfully accused, and they try to fight off the crowd, but they end up getting basically arrested, and they get put in a phony trial, and they get taken out of this cornfield, and they basically get burned at the stake. And Constantine wakes up in the morning, and he looks over, and he realizes at night that his wife doesn't have the healing factor he does, because she only got the one pill. So he knows like she can't heal from injury. She basically just doesn't age. Like, she can heal slowly and she can't drown, but like she can't, if you cut her, yeah, it'll heal faster, but it won't be like supernatural healing. So he knows like she is liable to be killed. And so when they're burned at the stake, he knows like she won't survive it. So he wakes up in the morning in the ashes, and he's just like digging through the ashes, and there's just nothing left. So he goes to the leader of the mob. He shows up naked, still covered in ash, and strangles the guy to death. And the people think it's a ghost, because he's white, covered in ash, like, and they think a ghost came and killed him. So then he goes off in the wilderness, and he tries to take his own life in a bunch of different ways, but he always heals. So eventually he comes back, and he's like, he shot himself, just did everything. And so like, once he gives up on that, he sees that people thought he was dead. They took his daughter and brought her to a home. So she's with a new family. So he goes and takes all the money they saved, and he just leaves like basically a chest full of just coins on their doorstep. And he just heads north, or he heads just off. He heads south, actually. And he ends up just wandering and gambling in brothels. And eventually the Revolutionary War breaks out, and he fights in this war in a battle, and he realizes how it's the first time he's felt anything since his wife died, because he's just been wandering and drinking and going gambling. And he actually ends up starting his own like gambling brothel kind of bar, and so he just runs that. And so when the war breaks out, he fights in it, and he basically just loves it, and he waits for all the wars. And so he goes along, he ends up fighting, he ends up growing his bars and becoming a chain of bars. And he hears about this war over in Europe, this great war, but it's across the ocean. And his last time he crossed the ocean was so bad for him. He wants nothing to do with it. So he's just waiting, hoping the war breaks out back home. And so he waits and waits and waits, and then he hears the war ended, and he's devastated, and he's like, I will never miss a war like that again. So when World War II breaks out, he joins immediately, and he ends up going to D-Day, and he ends up fighting at D-Day, and then he uses all his ties back home to get sent over to Japan and fight in island hop in Japan. So he ends up over there, fighting over there, and he ends up getting caught in a bonsai charge and injured, and he gets taken to a hospital where they witness his healing. And so he actually gets arrested, and he gets taken down, basically like blindfold put over him, and he gets taken, just flown, like sailed across the sea. He gets flown in planes, driven in cars. He doesn't know where he's at. Just sacks over his head, and he ends up in like the basement of this building where they interrogate him for years and figure out everything he knows, and they just keep him in there and they study him, and he basically has this apartment in there and he just lives in there. And there's this little janitor boy, and he becomes friends with the janitor, and he's like saying like, you know, how honorable the kid's job is, and he's doing great, and how like the company can't run without what he does. And eventually one day the janitor boy shows up, and he's like, you know, gray haired and older. And the janitor's like, you know, I took all the tips and the advice you gave me. He's like, and I put myself through college and I did all this stuff. And he goes, I'm the CEO of this company. He's like, and 10 years ago, we broke our contract off with the government, so we're completely private now. And he's basically like, as the CEO of this company, you're free to go. And so Constantine's like, what? So he goes up like out into the sun, and he's in the middle of New York. And it's just like, the cars are all crazy, the noise is crazy, everything's so colorful. And he ends up deciding to go down to like a veterans association to go to the bar. And he goes into this bar, and they're like, oh, like you went to Vietnam too? Like there's all these vets, and then all these older guys are up at the bar, won't let him go up to the bar because he's a younger vet. And they're like, we don't let your kind up here at the bar. And he doesn't understand. These other guys at the table are like, hey, come drink with us. And they're like, hey, we're other Vietnam vets. Like you're cool with us, man. And so he drinks with them, but then he sees the CEO who had just let him free, and he's like, here. And so the CEO takes him across the street, and they eat lunch. And the CEO says how they've been testing his blood and stuff in years. They said, we've cured so many diseases from studying you, that like you've saved so many people. And he just sees this, and he realizes all these years he thought he was just this object of death, like this war machine. But he sees what them studying his blood and everything had done. And he realizes how many people he saved. And so the CEO cuts him a check, and he's like, you were locked. He's like, this is the best. I had to go to the board and explain your situation. He's like, this is the biggest check they would allow me to cut. And they basically cut him a check for like 300,000 or $1 million or something. And so, but he's like just reeling with like, I've saved so many people. And so he gets a plan in his head, and he hears about Vegas because he's read newspapers and stuff. So he heads straight to Vegas, and he starts playing poker, and he starts winning his money. And he basically goes through Vegas and card counts and does all this stuff from all his years of gambling until they essentially run him out of Vegas. And he decides like, okay, Vegas is tapped. And he like quadruples his money in that time. So then he starts a pharmaceutical company, this Plenary Inc., and he grows it. And he starts being the one who tests his own blood. And then he gets all these departments and these buildings rising over the world. And he just builds these medicines. And then he helps to invent some machines that help. And so he's just basically this company that's just helping people around the world and like curing diseases. And eventually he ends up in this tower in Chicago. It's like his main tower. And he has this suite at the top. And then, so one day he's walking into work, and he sees this homeless man who's standing on the side of the road. And he looks at the homeless man. He looks so familiar. And the homeless man's standing there, and he's like, here. he sees the man's holding out his hand, and he's like begging for change, but he sees his other change, and he looks in there, and he sees a coin, and he recognizes the coin as a coin from before the flood, like this ancient coin that he hasn't seen since before the flood. And so he reaches in his pocket and he gives the man all his money. And then he sees the man's shirt's kind of torn. He's like, here, he takes his shirt and his suit jacket off. He's like, here, take mine. He gives him the shirt off his back. And he's like, here. And then he's like just mesmerized with the man's eyes. Just looks like a universe behind his eyes. And he's like, here, he gives him everything. And the homeless man just kind of stands there. He doesn't really move or say anything. And then he's like, okay, like I have to go to work, you know? But the man just never says anything. So he kind of turns and he heads into work. And, you know, the homeless man like is standing over this blanket that he set out for himself. And so Constantine goes to work basically with his shirt off. And then that's when he meets the girl from the beginning. And so then she works with him, and she goes in his lab, and she realizes that what he's done is real. Like she actually witnesses his healing, and she's like, this story is real? Like this is all real? He's like, yep. You know, and she spends like 6 months just working, and he's like, I want to like train you. I want you to know how to do this. He lets her make certain decisions. And then one day she wakes up with a knock at her door, and she checks it, and she has this package. It's a vanilla envelope, and the vanilla envelope falls out, and it's got this bottle of pills in it and just a letter. And in the letter, it's Constantine, and he's like, you remember my story I told you? And he's like, when we were in Salem and we had a daughter, he's like, I never lost track. He's like, my whole life after that, no matter what happened, I always made sure to follow, like keep track of where my daughter was. And when she eventually had a daughter or a son, like I kept track of them, and I followed them all the way through the years. She's like, eventually leading to you. He's like, your great, great, great grandmother was my daughter. And he's like, I'm going away. He's like, I've done everything this life can do. He's like, I'm leaving the company to you. He's like, everyone knows it. And so she like turns on the TV, and she sees that there's this helicopter that just flew into a volcano. And they're like, it's Constantine Planeri's helicopter crashed into a volcano today. And they're like, active CEO, and it's like her name. And she's like, oh my gosh, like I am like CEO of Planeri Inc. And Constantine like crashed into a volcano. And like, because she remembered like it's the only thing that could hurt him. And so she kind of heads downstairs with the idea of like, I'm going to take all the lessons I learned from him, and I'm going to do what I can to run this company to the best of my ability. And that is Forever Man. Oh, and it says, in the letter, it says, these pills in this bottle are the pills. He's like, I reverse engineered it. I figured out how to make the immortality pills. He's like, I'm going to leave them with you. He's like, you're the only one who has a set. He's like, it's up to you if you want to take them or not, but here are the pills. I leave them with you. Do with them what you will. And she takes them and looks at them, and she throws them in the trash, and then heads out to try and run this company. That is the Forever Man. Anyway. Okay, bye.